On to our third panelist, Professor Bilal Orfali from American University, Beirut, the host of the conference, together with Professor Abu-Husayn. He will speak on an anthology within an anthology, poetry and Sufi manuals. Move on to.
Thank you, Tayyib. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, David, for these very rich papers. Actually, my mind is still occupied with these two papers that I think I need 2 hours to digest, but I'll try my best. And it's amazing how the three of us are working on poetry in anthologies, but we take completely different approaches. So, an anthology within an anthology, poetry in Sufi manuals. And I wanted to say poetry in Sufi anthologies, but then I thought, 3 words of anthologies and a conference on anthology is just a little bit too much. It is common practice in modern times to read mystical poetry and apply it to our mundane lives and loves. I know this very well from my class on Sufi literature. My students come to Sufi literature, but what they're really interested in is love, or love poetry. Sufis in the early period did the opposite. Their mystical hymns often spun out of the courtly poetic ghazal, panegyric, and wine songs. Poetry appears to have been closely associated with the lives, thoughts, and the legacy of the Sufi personalities of the 8th to the 10th centuries, Common Era, of course, as is apparent in the primary anthologies of their akhbar and statements. These Sufis and pietists used poetry to describe mystical experiences and thoughts which were better hidden in subtle intimations than expressed in statements of prose. This is very clear in the use of poetry in Sufi anthologies. Let me first explain what I mean by Sufi anthologies, or Sufi manuals if you want, or Sufism do it your own way, or as one of my students once said, Sufism for dummies. We have very few books of Sufism in the formative period, that is the 3rd century of Hijrah and 9th century. We don't know exactly why this is the case. We know that these books did exist because we know this from the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim, for example, or just look at Sezgin. Perhaps because of the trial of Al-Hallaj, of the Mihna of Al-Hallaj, perhaps because scholars in the later century didn't feel the urge or the need, or they felt wary of copying these books. Perhaps because of the enmity between the Sufis and the Mu'tazila, between the Sufis and the Fuqaha, between the Sufis and Ahl al-Hadith, or the Sufis and the Qurra for that sake. But most of the anecdotes, these stories do survive orally, and the anecdotes, reports, and poems from the formative period survive in Sufi anthologies, handbooks, and treatises from the 10th and 11th centuries. Of course, Adam, they silenced many texts. This is very clear. Even they say that they silenced these many texts. So what I'm talking about, more or less, is Kitab al-Ta'arruf li Madhab Ahl al-Tasawwuf of Kalabazi, introducing the Sufi way of the people of Sufism. Al-Luma, the Book of Flashes of Al-Sarraj, Tahdhib al-Asrar, Refining the Secrets of Al-Khargoushi, the famous treatise on Sufism of Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri, Salwat al-Arifin, The Comfort of the Mystics of Abu Khalaf al-Tabari, Kitab al-Bayad wal-Sawad, Book of Black and White of As-Sirjani. More or less, they all come from the eastern part of the Muslim world, mostly from Nishapur, except for Al-Kalabadi. And they're more or less 4th century or early 5th century. So these anthologies and treatises contain hundreds of lines of poetry, often with separate chapters dedicated to the performance of this poetry in the Sama', the Sufi concert, and other chapters on the poetic verses chosen by the Sufis to illustrate their mystical experiences. Sometimes Sufi authors composed works for this purpose. We have 2 such works, the Kitab al-Amthal wal-Istishhadat, Book of Examples and Poetic Illustrations by Abu Abdulrahim al-Sulami, which I published recently, and Kitab al-Shawahid wal-Amthal, Book of Poetic Illustrations and Examples of Abu Nasr al-Qushayri, still in manuscript form. Abu Abdulrahim al-Sulami compiled a treatise on Sufi poetry under the title Kitab al-Amthal wal-Istishhadat, as I said. Okay. So elsewhere, I have written about the use of poetry in the Sufi concert and about these two books, Kitab al-Amthal and Kitab al-Shawahid. I have explained how court poetry from the ghazal, wine, or panegyric tradition gained Sufi dimensions that exerted a strong influence on the Sufis. This is published in a volume that Maurice Pomerantz and one of his colleagues edited at NYU. For the use of poetry in Sama', my main argument in that article was that Sama' is an act of recollection, of dhikr. The souls reawaken at remembering the archetypal moment of divine awareness, the primordial covenant, Yawm al-Mithaq, or Yawm al-Astu. On this pre-existential day described in the Quran, before their creation, human beings stood witness in the form of specks of light to God's lordship. God asked them, "Am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum?" To which they affirmed, "Bala." The Sufis' aim is to reenact the witnessing on the day of the primordial covenant through constant recollection of God. Dhikr means both to mention but also to remember. Thus, the role of poetry in Sama' is to remind the Sufis of that moment, and they often use poetry in their Sama' concerts. I'm going to give one example and jump into something else. How poetry is used in the Sama' concert. This is the example. Ahmad ibn Muqatil al-Akki related when Dhunnun al-Misri entered Baghdad, local Sufis gathered around him. Among them was a singer, Qawwal. The Sufis asked Dhunnun permission to have him, the singer, perform something for them. Of course, this was controversial. So they had to get his permission. He gave them his permission, and the singer began to recite, صغير هواك عذبني صغير هواك عذبني فكيف به إذا احتنك وأنت جمعت من قلبي هوى قد كان مشتركا أما ترثي لمكتئب إذا ضحك الخلي بكى. Even a little amount of my passion for you has caused me great pain. What would happen if it were to take full control over me? You have brought together in my heart a passion that used to be shared with others. Have you no sympathy for one who is broken by mourning, who weeps while one who is free from affliction is laughing? On hearing this, Dhunnun stood up and fell on his face, blood streaming from his forehead into the ground. Then one of the Sufis also stood up and it displayed ecstatic behavior. Dhunnun told him, quoting the Quran, the all-compassionate who sees you when you stand, الذي يراك حين تقوم. And the man sat down. So this is an example of poetry used in a Sama' setting, causing ecstatic behavior. My main argument for the use of poetry in specialized books, Sufi books on poetry, Kitab al-Amthal and Kitab al-Shawahid of Sulami and Qushayri, was that Sufi akhbar evoke past poets and their poetic heritage. Sufis tend to quote eminent poets whose poetry must have been widely circulated and memorized. Yet Sufi akhbar place this readily recognizable poetry in a new context that deliberately changes the past. So they quote figures like Abu Tammam, Mutanabbi, Majnun Layla, Ibn Rumi is well quoted, Ammar bin Abi Rabi'a, etc. But they deliberately change the past. Majnun becomes a Sufi who left reason aside. His beloved Layla stands as a symbol of divinity. Abu Luwas becomes a toxic Sufi, and his wine is a symbol for divine wisdom and knowledge. Ibn Rumi, Abu Tammam, Buhturi, and Mutanabbi stand in the court of the quintessential generous patron, Allah, and seek his bounty. It is in some sense a process of metaphorization in which the reality of the pre-Islamic Umayyad and Abbasid models now act as a device or metaphor for the Sufi poetics. The Sufi who recites the poem illustrates, explains, or justifies his mystical experience or idea via the embedded motif or theme. But at the same time, the Sufi performer evokes, links, and reinterprets the poetic heritage associated with the poem, thus placing himself within a poetic tradition against which his own experience becomes more evident. Despite this evocation of the poetic heritage and in order to dehistoricize the poems, these texts rarely name the original composers. To the Sufis, everyone else who composed poetry was a Sufi, and these poets were talking about human experiences with the divine. I'm going to give one example and jump into something also else. My example is from Kitab al-Amthal wal-Istishhadat of al-Sulami. I heard Ahmad ibn Ali bin Ja'far say, when Murta'ish was asked about Sufism, he said, Sufism is ambiguity and disguise. Al-Ibham wa talbis. He chanted, Sirri wa sirruka, la ya'lam bihi ahadun, illa al-khalilu, wa la yantiq bihi natiqu. My secret and your secret, no one knows it but the friend, and no one else speak of it. He then chanted, إذا جئت فامنح طرف عينيك غيرنا لكي يحسبوا أن الهوى حيث تنظر. Obviously, Umar bin Abi Rabi'a. If you return, cast your eye on someone else so that our tribe will think you love another. So they expressed their feelings, their state, using this love poetry. There is another use of poetry in Sufi anthologies. We often find poetic epigrams, to use a term maqtu'a, to use a term that my friend Adam uses often, as conclusions to chapters in Sufi anthologies. So more or less, these Sufi anthologies have 70 chapters or 72 chapters, referring to a hadith by the Prophet that, his ummah will be divided into 70 firqa, and so they have 70 chapters, and the last chapter is often about the Sufis, the hagiographies of the Sufis. So this is the Al-Firqa Najiyah. So we find poetry, these epigrams, as conclusions to each chapters. I'm going to take one example. The Kitab al-Bayad wa Sawad of Al-Kirmani Sirjani died 429, which I edited with my colleague from the Lebanese American University, Nada Saab. The text of Al-Kitab al-Bayad wa Sawad collects the mystical traditions of past eminent Sufis, who are, in Sirjani's opinion, few in number, but have great stature with their Lord. This is woven into 73 chapters. Each chapter focuses on a single Sufi concept or rule of conduct that is illustrated by the dicta of Sufi masters, Quranic verses, prophetic traditions, in addition to other sources of wisdom literature and poetry selections. So, for example, we found a chapter on zuhud, a chapter on mahabba, a chapter on sama', a chapter on tawakkul, for example. Throughout, Sirjani's voice remains veiled behind the vast network of utterances. Collectively, these utterances draw a picture of spirituality and the self-effacing quest for an all-encompassing divine reality. As author, however, and I claim here that Sirjani is an author, not only a compiler, and this is my argument, Sirjani appears to be performing this very same self-effacing practice of the Sufis. His individual I as a speaker or commentator on various dicta recedes in favor of earlier mystics recounting their own stories and experiences, or in favor of third-person speakers who were either witnesses to these stories or later narrators of them. His creativity as an author appears hidden in his selection and recombination of earlier traditions into new groups and categories. His voiced opinion is present in the introduction of the book and in his short comments, which conclude the theme of every chapter and connect it with to the theme of the next. These short comments are often coupled, most often actually coupled, with few lines of poetry. I read this poetry as a form that embraced Sirjani's voice. A poetic selection often gives the concluding remark. Poetic conclusions seem to conjure the mystical concepts in question. They highlight the experience they entail and in a way lend Sirjani that concluding voiced opinion. I claim that poetry plays a special function in Kitab al-Bayad wa Sawad. In a way, it is Sirjani's hidden voice. And often we don't find this poetry anywhere else. So he's most probably not even composing it, not copying it or getting it, anthologizing it, but composing it himself. Sometimes, of course, he is anthologizing it. we find a final use in Sufi poetry that I would like to deal with today, and that is the separate chapters dedicated to poetry in some Sufi anthologies. So poetry can be the conclusion of chapters, can be embedded within akhbar in various chapters, but can also be collected in separate chapters. And this is where my title comes from, an anthology within an anthology. One finds one of these in Kitab al-Bayad wa Sawad again, under the title ذكر الأشعار الذي أشار به القوم على إظهار حال أو جواب سؤال. So the poetry in this chapter either expresses a state, an ecstatic state, or is an answer to a question. And the chapter collects these stories. I'm going to illustrate with one example. Oh, actually, what is interesting here to me as well is that the chapter, often these chapters actually, Sufis, because they're accused of not having their origin from the Quran or in the Quran, they tend to start each chapter with Quran. So mahabba yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbuna, or tawakkul, or etc. With poetry, of course, Quran has a negative attitude, more or less a negative attitude towards poetry. So this is, of course, not quoted. What is quoted is hikmatun balighatun fama tughni an-nudhur. Of course, this is not poetry. But then the exact statement that comes after that is a hadith of the Prophet, inna min ash-sha'ri la hikmah. So we have hikmah and then a hadith connecting hikmah to poetry, and then comes poetry. So this is how the anthologist found, with quoting a hadith and quoting an ayah, justified the use of poetry in Sufism. Okay, so my example is this. Someone asked Samnoon about God saying, so they plotted a plot and we plotted a plot. وَمَكَرُوا مَكْرًا وَمَكَرْنَا مَكْرًا. Is it permissible to ascribe plotting, makr, to God? Because makr, of course, is not a positive word, or doesn't have a positive connotations. Samnoon replied, وَيَقْبُحُ مِنْ سِوَاكَ الْفِعْلُ عِنْدِي وَيَقْبُحُ مِنْ سِوَاكَ الْفِعْلُ عِنْدِي فَتَفْعَلُهُ فَيَحْسُنُ مِنْ كَذَاكَ. So the act from someone other than you is hateful to me, you carry it out, and I find it beautiful. The person said, of course, he answered him, but he answered him in poetry. The person said, I ask you to comment on a Quranic verse and you reply in poetry? Samnoon asked him, from which land are you? From Al-Jabal, he replied. Samnoon then said, oh, you coarse one, ya Lujafi. God took an oath not to entrust his wisdom in a barbarian heart. I did not answer you in poetry because I'm incapable of clear expression. Rather, I wanted to teach you that in the mere trifle of things lies the strongest indication to him. Of course, one can go on and on on this, but I don't have time, so I will jump into another chapter. In Kitab Tahdhib al-Asrar of al-Khargoushi, and it's unfortunate that there are very few studies that look at this work. He's a contemporary to Sulami, actually, and pre-Qushayri. One finds a title, باب في ذكر بعض ما ينشد من أشعارهم. And in Salwat al-Arifin of Abu Khalaf al-Tabari, which I edited recently with Gerhard Bovering, published in Brill, we find the title, a very similar title, باب في بيان بعض ما ينشد من أشعارهم. Interestingly, these two chapters just list the poetry that is usually quoted in Sufi works, without any prose. وأنشد or Samnoon, and they list the poetry. And of course, they put Shibli quoting Majnoon Layla, وأنشد الشبلي, and then it's a line by Majnoon Layla. Right? So interestingly, these two chapters just list the poetry that is usually quoted in Sufi works, such as in Sufi manuals and in Sufi commentaries on the Quran or hagiographies, tabaqat. So these two authors have looked at all Sufi books until their time, and they're not many, and they collected all the poetry and put it in one chapter. Of course, there is an overlap between the two works. It does so without context, without a context or a khabar, or without any commentary. It is as though Khargoushi and Tabari are providing a reference, an index of motif for other Sufi writers to use in their writings, or for Sufis to use in their sama' gathering or meditations. So you want to use poetry, this is an index of motifs, and this is how you do it. This is the poetry that you can quote. In general, the use of poetry, and this is my conclusion, is very common in Sufi works, and it serves several functions within the khabar or within the work as a whole, not only within the khabar. There were those who disapproved of the use of poetry, as we saw in the story of Samnoon, for example. Moreover, not everyone accepted this metaphorical use of the motifs and topoi of classical poetry. It was not very obvious to some. Consider the following anecdote from Kitab al-Shawahid wal-Amthal. He said, meaning his father, Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri, one faqir heard a singer chanting, يقولون ليلى بالعراق مريضة فأقبلت من مصر إليها أعودها. They say Layla is in Iraq and is sick. I came from Egypt to visit her. The faqir stood and displayed ecstatic behavior. Oh, Layla's sick. I need to visit her. A common man asked, who is Layla to him? Why is he behaving this way? People told him there is no relation, qaraba, between them. This is a coining of a likeness, darb masal, mathal. The man then insulted and started to beat him. Yet to the Sufis, so there are those who disapproved of the use of poetry completely. Yet to the Sufis, these earlier poets are the Sufis' predecessors, their prototypes. The courtly motifs and topoi refer to the human experience of the divine or to the memory of it. The same motifs are also a reminder of past poets who have stood in the same position. The past that's conjured up here is a poetic one. Thank you.